Opening the queen and bishop, this pawn thrust instantly stakes a claim in the center, promising an aggressive game. Instantly seizing control of the d4 square, Sicilian defense introduces immediate central imbalance and tactical complexity. Opening up lines for central development, this knight jump prepares for nc and prepares to castle, embracing dynamic play. Embracing a closed structure, black aims for pawn breaks in the center. Striking the center immediately, this advance challenges black's pawn structure and aims to seize more territory. Instantly opening the c-file grants black immediate counterplay and challenges white's central pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn opens diagonals for your bishops and asserts central influence, aiming for rapid development. Developing the knight to c6 organically contests the center and prepares further piece activity in this sharp Sicilian. Developing that knight further solidifies central control and prepares for queenside expansion. Developing the queen here fortifies the pawn and readies for central challenges, though it somewhat restricts knight mobility. Developing the bishop here aims to control important central squares and prepare for castling, subtly reinforcing white's central pawn structure. Securing the b5 square for potential queen or knight maneuvers, while subtly preparing a queenside pawn advance, is the essence here. Gaining control of the light squares, this bishop readies for a central role, eyeing potential pressure points. Developing the kingside knight ignites a latent tactical skirmish, aiming to control the central squares. Securely tucking the king away sets the stage for a more aggressive central pawn push. Challenging the central pawn structure, this knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential disruptions on the kingside. Preventing a knight's disruptive jump to g4 secures the kingside and allows for a calmer build-up. Expanding on the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to gain space and challenge white's central grip. Unleashing aggression, white seeks to dominate the center and potentially expose black's king by opening the f-file. Challenging the central light square control, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's harmonious development by forcing a trade. Sacrificing the bishop opens the diagonal for the queen and resolves the knight's outpost, simplifying the center. A bold recapture, black's queen dances into a potentially exposed central position, creating immediate tactical fireworks and a sharp positional struggle. Centralizing the queen immediately stakes a claim and pressures d4, while also preparing for an eventual kingside advance. Developing the bishop to b7 now bolsters the queenside and aims to unpin the knight, preparing for a more active game. Confronting black's queenside expansion with a bold pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. Trading queens now simplifies the position, likely leading to a more endgame-oriented struggle where piece activity will be paramount. Opening the c-file now allows for rapid central pawn pressure and potential piece activation, creating dynamic play. Instantly seizing the queenside pawn's newfound reach, this advance aims to disrupt white's developing pieces and generate central pawn weaknesses for black. Reclaiming the knight to a central outpost sets up for a pawn advance and better piece coordination. Unleashing the bishop to patrol the long diagonal, this maneuver prepares for future queenside pressure while subtly challenging white's pawn structure. Securing the open c-file asserts central control, preparing for potential breakthroughs and piece activity. Black solidifies pawn structure, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially unblock the bishop. Securing the king's central position allows for greater piece maneuverability, aiming to control the d-file and prepare for future pawn advancements. Unlocking the d-file for black's rook and preparing to contest key central squares. Reclaiming central space, the knight aims to anchor itself on d4, disrupting black's queenside pawn structure and potentially activating the d-file. Sacrificing a bishop for a knight here liberates black's central pawns and opens avenues for queenside expansion, potentially leading to dynamic play. King exposure is the immediate consequence of this capture, opening avenues for black's remaining pieces. Opening up the queenside for the rooks, but potentially weakening the pawn structure. This advance prepares to seize open files and attack black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure. Securing the open c-file seems logical, but allows white's knight to become very active, potentially menacing squares like d5. Clearing the central file after the exchange signals an imminent push to dominate open lines, potentially leading to endgame advantages. Finally, the bishop clears the way for the other pieces, aiming to exploit the open c-file. Securing the open c-file now is paramount, aiming to outmaneuver black's rook and potentially exploit weaknesses. Black repositions the bishop to a less exposed diagonal, aiming to secure the queenside pawns before committing further piece activity. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside now, aiming to create a passed pawn or open lines against the black monarch. Seeking safety from the kingside storm, the knight retreats but sacrifices valuable central influence. Securing the knight's advanced outposts is paramount before challenging black's kingside space. Reasserting influence on the queenside by redeploying the bishop to a more active diagonal. The knight repositions, seeking a more active role on the queenside, aiming to pressure black's extended pawns. Relocating the knight to the e7 square aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and potentially prepare a queenside expansion later on. Unlocking the d-file provides a potential pathway for the queen, while also opening lines for white's rook. Gaining central control with the knight here is a wise maneuver, preparing for future skirmishes. Unleashing central pawns disrupts black's kingside blockade and opens paths for white's rooks. Unleashing the kingside pawns creates immediate attacking potential, though it opens lines for enemy counterplay. Opening the center like this invites a knight fork and weakens the kingside pawn structure. Opening the h-file creates dynamic possibilities, but exposes black's king further to the attacking knights. Exploiting the open e-file, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's pieces and create new attacking avenues. Abandoning the passed pawn opens crucial lines for the white king's escape. Unleashing a potent fork, this knight's sacrifice aims to dismantle black's weakened king's safety and seize material advantage. The king scurries to safety, but the exposed d6 pawn now beckons further piece play. Unleashing the rook to actively contest the h-file, this sortie aims to exploit potential weaknesses around the black king's sanctuary. Consolidating the king, a necessary but passive step, faces increasing pressure on the kingside. The rook now prowls the 7th rank, threatening deep infiltration and creating immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. The black king, now exposed, seeks shelter on the final rank from the looming white rook. Consolidating pawn structure and preparing for endgame simplification is the idea behind this move. Activating the knight to centralize its influence opens up avenues for future pawn advances or piece regrouping. Unleashing a rook to the kingside could spark immediate complications for the black king. Shifting the king offers a precarious respite, but the open files remain a serious concern. Clearing the way for the king to infiltrate through the center unlocks new attacking possibilities. The bishop now repositions to a more active diagonal, eyeing white's central pawns and potentially supporting a knight's advance. Capturing that knight opens the b-file, a key pathway for your rook to infiltrate black's territory. This recapture solidifies black's knight, offering a more secure presence on the queenside while white's pawn structure remains slightly compromised. Securing the open file is paramount now, aiming to pressure the isolated pawn. A strategic retreat, redeploying the rook to a potentially active central file, anticipating the pawn structure's evolution. Asserting control over the crucial c-file, this move pressures black's rook and prepares to penetrate their defenses. Opening the f-file now could expose your king to further pressure down the open column. A timely knight check forces the black king into a compromised position, opening avenues for white's initiative. Relocating the king to the queenside seems odd, leaving it exposed on the kingside under fire. Unlocking the b-file offers a potent infiltration route for the rook. The knight surrenders a crucial central outpost, now aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queen side. Capturing that pawn creates a dominant knight outpost on a central square. Repositioning the knight to the c8 square seeks to activate it defensively and potentially support a future advance on the queen side. Reclaiming the open file is a tactical necessity to disrupt black's entrenched position and activate white's rooks. Reclaiming the rook from its passive outpost is a sensible regrouping, aiming to contest the open file and organize defenses. Establishing a strong central foothold, this pawn push aims to restrict black's bishop and gain critical space. Sensing an opportunity to centralize the rook and threaten the vulnerable pawns, black aims to disrupt white's blockade. Activating the monarch strategically opens lines and prepares for endgame maneuvering. Preparing to undermine the central pawns offers black a chance to activate its pieces. The king's central escape route is now aggressively pursued, seeking safety. Exploring the dark squares, Rh8 aims to bolster the king's precarious shelter, though it relinquishes some central presence. A cunning repositioning to target the exposed d-pawn, anticipating a potential breakthrough. Bringing the king closer to the action, this redeployment aims to bolster the defensive structure and prepare for the upcoming pawn push. Sacrificing a pawn to expose the enemy king and initiate a decisive attack. Retreating the king allows the rook to support the pawn advance, but it leaves the king exposed to further checks. Seizing control of the queenside outpost, this knight jump prepares to harass the enemy pawn structure. Activating the rook to the first rank finally offers some counterplay, aiming to exploit the opponent's potentially exposed monarch in the coming exchanges. Unleashing a powerful discovered attack, this rook sortie aims to shatter the pawn's shield protecting the black king. Relocating the king to a safer square is paramount, as the powerful rook now controls the crucial 7th rank. Repositioning the knight offers crucial support for the d-pawn's advance and seeks a more active central influence. A desperate check, black desperately seeks to disrupt white's encroaching endgame dominance. The king advances, aiming to seize control of the d-file and disrupt black's rook. The rook regains a crucial outpost, preparing to exploit the open c-file and potentially harass the enemy king. Pushing the passed pawn creates immediate tactical complications and forces black to react, potentially disrupting their defensive setup. A desperate attempt to exploit the exposed king, though the material deficit likely seals the game. Securing the d7 pawn with the rook is crucial, forcing black's knight to retreat and preserving white's advantage. Seeking shelter for the king amidst the ensuing chaos of the passed pawn and white's looming pressure. Snapping up the pawn now seizes crucial space, potentially restricting black's rook and opening avenues for the king. This king's desperate march gambles on reaching safety, but the pawn push leaves it exposed to the relentless white rook. Challenging the black king forces immediate decisions, potentially disrupting its safety. Securing the rook's retreat, this cautious king retreats to safety, anticipating the impending danger on the 7th rank. Unleashing the rook to an active outpost offers a potent attack on black's exposed king. The rook retreats to a more active square, anticipating a potential exchange or support for a pawn push. Securing the king with the monarch grants breathing room and prepares to advance the pawns. The knight retreats, seeking a safer square but abandoning the fight for central control. Opening the kingside flank for potential infiltration seems premature given the opponent's active rook. Challenging the king's safety with a bold rook sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated position. Capturing the pawn shores up the king, simplifying into a potentially winning rook and pawn endgame. Unleashing a knight's daring sortie disrupts white's coordination, aiming to disrupt the pawn promotion hopes. Unleash the knight to corner the opponent's monarch before it's too late for any kingly escape. Snatching the pawn initiates a race against the exposed king, hoping to outpace the advancing white queen. The pawn's advance now threatens to become a formidable passer, a stark contrast to the scattered pawns black is struggling with. Bringing the knight to the center offers a dynamic defensive posture, eyeing potential checks and complicating white's pawn push. The pawn's final advance creates an unstoppable threat to reach the promotion square, forcing black to abandon their king. The rook's retreat to the only available square offers no tactical reprieve. A surprising check that forces the king to expose itself further, potentially leading to a swift conclusion.